In the early years of the air war over Europe, American bombers were flying into a trap. Massive formations of heavy aircraft crossed the skies by day, deep into enemy territory, carrying the promise of industrial destruction. But they were alone. Fighter escorts could not stay with them long enough, and the enemy knew it. German interceptors waited patiently beyond the range of Allied fighters. Once escorts turned back, the bombers were exposed. Losses mounted at an alarming rate. Entire crews vanished over hostile territory. For all their firepower, the bombers could not survive without protection, and no existing American fighter could provide it. The problem was not speed. It was not firepower. It was distance. Europe was simply too vast. Fighters burned fuel too quickly. Even the best designs of the early war years reached their limits long before the bombers reached their targets. Strategists faced an impossible equation. How to escort bombers all the way to the heart of Germany and bring the fighters home again? Factories could replace aircraft. They could not replace experienced crews at the same pace. Each mission without adequate escort threatened to break the entire daylight bombing strategy. Something had to change. The answer would not come from doctrine alone. It would come from engineering, from a fighter designed not just to fight, but to endure. A machine that could stay in the air longer than any enemy expected. Before it became a legend, before it dominated the skies, the P-51 Mustang was born out of desperation. It was not designed to win dogfights at first. It was designed to solve a problem no other fighter could. The P-51 Mustang did not begin its life as a masterpiece. It was born under pressure, designed and built with remarkable speed as the war demanded immediate solutions. American engineers were tasked with creating a new fighter in record time, and they delivered an aircraft that looked promising, but flawed. Early Mustangs were fast at low altitude and stable in flight, yet they struggled where it mattered most. High above Europe, at bomber escort altitudes, their engines gasped for power. They could reach the battlefield, but they could not dominate it. Once again, distance and altitude threatened to undermine the mission. Everything changed with a single decision. The Mustang was paired with a new engine, one that transformed the aircraft's potential almost overnight. With its new power plant, the P-51 climbed higher, flew faster, and performed better at altitude than anything the Allies had fielded before. The transformation was dramatic. What had been a capable but limited fighter became something entirely different. Range, speed, and endurance converged into a single machine. For the first time, American bombers had a fighter that could stay with them. Not just part of the way, but all the way. Pilots immediately felt the difference. The aircraft was smooth, responsive, and forgiving. It rewarded confidence rather than punishing it. In the air, the Mustang was not merely fast, it was efficient. Every gallon of fuel mattered, and the P-51 used it better than any fighter before it. The Mustang had been reborn, not through radical redesign, but through understanding what the war truly required. It was no longer just another fighter. It was becoming the solution the air war had been waiting for. What truly set the P-51 Mustang apart was not a single battle or a single victory. It was endurance. While other fighters turned back, the Mustang pressed on, deeper into hostile skies than any escort fighter before it. With external fuel tanks attached beneath its wings, the P-51 could accompany bombers from English airfields to targets deep inside Germany and back again. This was not a small improvement. It was a revolution. For the first time, there were no safe zones left for enemy interceptors to wait unchallenged. German pilots quickly realized the difference. The familiar rhythm of the air war was broken. Where bombers had once appeared alone, they now arrived surrounded. Where fighters had once disengaged safely, they were now followed, relentlessly. The Mustang did not simply escort, it hunted. Its pilots were encouraged to take the fight to the enemy, to seek out opposing aircraft on the ground and in the air, denying them the chance to regroup. Air superiority was no longer defensive. It became aggressive and continuous. This new reality transformed the skies over Europe. Bomber losses fell. Enemy fighters were forced into constant combat, draining pilots, fuel, and aircraft at a pace they could not sustain. The balance began to shift, not suddenly, but decisively. The P-51 had extended the battlefield itself. Distance was no longer protection. Endurance had become a weapon. As the P-51 Mustang spread across the skies of Europe, the balance of power began to change in ways that could not be ignored. For years, German fighters had dictated the terms of engagement. Now, for the first time, they were being challenged everywhere, and often on unfavorable terms. The Mustang combined speed, altitude performance, and range into a single, deadly equation. It could climb to meet enemy interceptors, dive to pursue them, and still remain with the bombers it was meant to protect. German pilots who once attacked with confidence now found themselves intercepted before they could even reach their targets. Airfields were no longer safe. Mustangs followed enemy aircraft home, striking them as they landed or caught them preparing for takeoff. The psychological impact was profound. Every mission carried uncertainty. Every scramble risked being intercepted before the fight even began. The Luftwaffe was forced into a defensive posture. Experienced pilots were pulled from offensive roles to protect cities and factories. Training units were disrupted. Replacement pilots entered combat faster with less preparation and faced an enemy that gave them no margin for error. The P-51 did not win the air war overnight, but it changed its direction. Control of the sky became something the Allies could seize and hold, not just near the front, but deep over enemy territory. For the first time, Germany was losing the battle of attrition in the air, and at the center of that shift flew the Mustang. The P-51 Mustang was more than a technical solution. It was a pilot's aircraft. Those who flew it quickly understood that it offered something rare in wartime aviation: confidence. The Mustang was fast, responsive, and balanced, allowing pilots to focus on the fight rather than on simply surviving the flight. In combat, the aircraft felt predictable and stable. It did not punish small mistakes the way some earlier fighters had. Instead, it rewarded situational awareness and discipline. Pilots could engage, disengage, and re-engage on their own terms, choosing when to fight and when to break away. Visibility from the cockpit was excellent, a crucial advantage in the chaos of aerial combat. Pilots could spot enemies sooner, track them longer, and react faster. Combined with strong firepower and high-speed performance, this situational edge often proved decisive. Just as important was trust. Escort missions lasted hours, stretching endurance and concentration. Pilots needed to believe that their aircraft would bring them home. The Mustang earned that trust. It is reliable, efficient, and capable of absorbing punishment without failing catastrophically. As confidence grew, tactics evolved. Mustang pilots became aggressive, pressing advantages and exploiting weaknesses. The aircraft did not merely protect bombers, it empowered the men flying it to dominate the airspace around them. In a war defined by machines, the P-51 stood out because it aligned perfectly with the human element. It amplified skill, rewarded judgment, and gave its pilots something increasingly rare in the skies of World War II: control. By 1944, the impact of the P-51 Mustang could be measured not just in victories, but in absence. Fewer German fighters reached the bomber formations. Fewer experienced pilots survived long enough to shape the course of the war. The Luftwaffe was being worn down systematically. Mustang escorts no longer stayed close in rigid formations. Instead, they ranged ahead and above the bombers, intercepting enemy aircraft before attacks could even form. German pilots were forced into combat at a disadvantage, often climbing desperately to reach altitude while already under attack. Every loss hurt more than the last. Germany could still build aircraft, but it could not replace experience. Training hours shrank. Fuel disappeared. New pilots arrived with minimal preparation, facing veterans flying some of the best escort fighters ever built. The P-51 accelerated this collapse. It denied the Luftwaffe rest, denied it safe airspace, and denied it the ability to rebuild. Even victories became costly. Survival itself became uncertain. This was not a single decisive battle. It was erosion. Day after day, mission after mission, the Mustang drained the strength of German air power until resistance became fragmented and ineffective. By the time Allied forces prepared to land in Western Europe, the skies were no longer contested in the same way. Air superiority had been won, not by numbers alone, but by a fighter that could stay, fight, and return. As the P-51 Mustang spread across every major Allied air unit, a new generation of air combat mastery emerged. This was not just about technology anymore. It was about confidence, coordination, and relentless pressure. Mustang pilots did not merely escort bombers. They controlled the sky around them. With air superiority increasingly secured, tactics evolved rapidly. Mustang squadrons operated with flexibility, adapting to changing conditions in real time. They hunted enemy fighters before they could organize, disrupted takeoffs, and forced the Luftwaffe into constant reaction. Initiative belonged to the Allies, and the Mustang was the instrument that made it possible. Pilots learned to exploit every advantage. Altitude was gained early, speed was preserved, engagements were chosen, not accepted by chance. When combat began, it was decisive. When it ended, Mustang pilots could disengage and return safely, something few of their opponents could reliably do. The psychological impact was immense. German pilots entered the air knowing they were outmatched not only by numbers, but by presence. There was no longer a moment of safety, not during climb, not during landing, not even over their own territory. For Allied airmen, the Mustang represented freedom of movement. It allowed them to think beyond survival and focus on dominance. In doing so, it reshaped how air wars were fought. The skies over Europe were no longer contested arenas. They were becoming Allied territory, claimed, held, and defended by the long-ranged wings of the P-51. As the Allies tightened their grip on the skies, the role of the P-51 Mustang expanded beyond escort. The fighter that had been designed to protect bombers now became a hunter, actively seeking out and destroying the remaining strength of enemy air power. Mustang pilots ranged far ahead of bomber formations, sweeping airfields, rail yards, and supply routes. Enemy aircraft were attacked on the ground before they could take off. Fuel depots burned. Infrastructure critical to air operations was systematically dismantled. The Luftwaffe was being denied not just the air, but the ability to fight at all. This shift marked a crucial evolution in air warfare. Air superiority was no longer measured only by victories in the sky, but by control of the entire aerial ecosystem: bases, fuel, maintenance, and movement. The P-51 was uniquely suited to this mission, combining range, speed, and endurance with precision. For German pilots, the war became increasingly asymmetric. Even when aircraft were available, fuel shortages and damaged airfields limited their use. Every attempt to regroup was met with immediate pressure. Every sortie risked destruction before combat even began. The Mustang's presence turned the skies into hostile territory for the enemy. What remained of German air power was forced into hiding, conserving strength that could no longer be effectively used. By the time ground forces advanced across Europe, the outcome in the air had already been decided. The P-51 had transformed from guardian to executioner, sealing the fate of the Luftwaffe through relentless pursuit. By the final year of the war in Europe, the outcome in the skies was no longer in doubt. The presence of the P-51 Mustang had fundamentally reshaped the balance of power. Air superiority was not a temporary advantage. It was permanent, enforced daily by fighters that could reach anywhere and stay as long as needed. Allied bombers now flew with confidence. Losses still occurred, but they no longer threatened the strategy itself. Factories, rail networks, and fuel facilities were struck repeatedly, accelerating the collapse of Germany's ability to wage war. The air war had become an engine of inevitability. German resistance in the air grew sporadic and disorganized. Isolated engagements replaced coordinated defense. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced pilots were gone. What remained could not challenge the constant pressure imposed by Mustang patrols. The P-51 did not fight alone, but it enabled everything else. It allowed bombing campaigns to succeed. It allowed ground operations to advance under protective skies. It gave Allied planners freedom to strike, to maneuver, and to decide the tempo of the war. This was the true victory of the Mustang. Not a single decisive battle, but a sustained dominance that removed choice from the enemy. The war in the air had been won, long before the war on the ground reached its final moments. Victory in the skies did not come without a price. While the P-51 Mustang gave the Allies dominance, it also demanded endurance from the men who flew it. Missions stretched for hours, often over hostile territory, pushing pilots to the limits of concentration and stamina. Escort flights required constant vigilance. There were no breaks, no moments of relaxation. A single lapse could mean missing an enemy attack or failing to return home. Fatigue accumulated silently, sortie after sortie, as pilots faced cold, oxygen deprivation, and the psychological strain of knowing that danger could appear at any moment. Losses still occurred. Mechanical failures, flak, and surprise attacks claimed aircraft and crews. Even with superiority secured, the air war remained unforgiving. Every empty seat in the briefing room was a reminder that dominance did not mean safety. For many pilots, the Mustang became both shield and burden. It could carry them through intense combat, but it also carried them deeper into danger than any fighter before it. The same range that made victory possible also extended exposure to risk. Air superiority was not achieved in a single moment of triumph. It was sustained through discipline, repetition, and sacrifice. The P-51 made control of the skies possible, but it was the pilots who paid the human cost to keep it that way. As the war neared its conclusion, the P-51 Mustang encountered something entirely new in the skies: aircraft that seemed to belong to the future. Jet fighters appeared briefly, unpredictably, and with startling speed. They were fast enough to strike and vanish before traditional tactics could respond. For Mustang pilots, these encounters were unsettling. The familiar rules of air combat no longer applied. Speed alone was no longer enough. Altitude and positioning mattered more than ever. Yet even against this new threat, the P-51 remained relevant, not by matching the jets, but by exploiting their weaknesses. Jet aircraft were fast, but few in number. They suffered from reliability issues, limited endurance, and inexperienced pilots. Mustangs waited, circled, and attacked when jets slowed to land or climb. The future had arrived, but it was not ready to take control. This moment marked a transition. The P-51 represented the peak of piston-engine fighter design, refined, mature, and brutally effective. Jets represented what was coming next. The Mustang stood between eras, holding dominance even as the rules began to change. By the time the war ended, the P-51 had proven something remarkable. It was not merely a weapon of its time. It was the standard against which the future would be measured, even as that future moved beyond it. Behind the sleek lines and long-range capability of the P-51 Mustang were thousands of young men carrying the weight of the air war on their shoulders. Victory in the skies depended not only on machines, but on endurance, discipline, and the ability to face fear day after day. Mustang pilots lived in a constant cycle of preparation and exhaustion. Briefings before dawn, hours in the cockpit, cold that numbed hands, oxygen masks that dried throats and blurred voices. Between missions, there was little time to process loss. Friends disappeared from formation, and their absence was felt immediately, in the air and on the ground. Unlike earlier fighters, the Mustang took pilots far from home bases. Many missions ended with damaged aircraft, wounded men, or emergency landings in unfamiliar territory. Survival often depended on calm judgment under extreme pressure. Yet the aircraft also gave pilots something invaluable: a sense of control. They trusted the Mustang. They believed it would bring them home if flown well. That trust allowed them to focus, to fight effectively, and to endure the psychological strain of a long war. The story of the P-51 is often told through victories and statistics, but its true legacy lives in the experiences of those who flew it. Ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances, sustained by a machine that matched their determination. As historians later looked back on the air war over Europe, one conclusion became increasingly clear. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang marked a turning point from which there was no return. It did not merely improve Allied capabilities, it altered the structure of the conflict itself. Before the Mustang, air power had limits. Operations were constrained by range, by fuel, by the necessity of turning back before the decisive moment. After the Mustang, those limits vanished. The sky became continuous, connected, and hostile to the enemy everywhere at once. This change reshaped Allied strategy. Bombing campaigns became sustainable. Ground offensives advanced under permanent air cover. Logistics moved with confidence. The war accelerated toward its conclusion not because the enemy suddenly weakened, but because freedom of action had been taken from them. The P-51 did not operate in isolation. It worked alongside bombers, ground forces, and naval power. But it was the connective element, the aircraft that ensured everything else could function without constant threat from above. In this sense, the Mustang's greatest achievement was not tactical brilliance par sacre, but strategic transformation. It turned air superiority from a temporary condition into a permanent reality. Few weapons in history can claim such an effect. The P-51 Mustang was one of them. When the war in Europe finally ended, the skies fell silent, but the legacy of the P-51 Mustang did not. Airfields that once launched daily combat missions now stood quiet, lined with aircraft that had carried the weight of victory across continents. For many pilots, the transition to peace was abrupt and disorienting. The routines of war vanished overnight. The aircraft that had defined their lives became symbols of something finished and something survived. The Mustang, once the tool of survival, now stood as a reminder of what had been endured. In the post-war world, the P-51 found new roles. It served with air forces across the globe, flown by nations rebuilding their defenses in an uncertain peace. It raced in competitions, flew in distant conflicts, and remained in service long after many expected it to fade away. This longevity spoke to the aircraft's design. The Mustang had not been created for a single battle or campaign. It had been built to endure, to adapt, and it continued to do so even after the war that gave it purpose had ended. Yet its wartime identity could never be erased. The P-51 would always be remembered first as the fighter that stayed, that flew farther, longer, and deeper than any escort before it. In doing so, it reshaped history. The P-51 Mustang did not become legendary because it was flawless. It became legendary because it arrived at the exact moment the war demanded something new and delivered what no other fighter could. Range, endurance, control. It solved a problem that strategy alone could not overcome. The Mustang proved that air power was not only about winning battles, but about shaping the entire course of a war. By protecting bombers deep into enemy territory, it unlocked the full potential of Allied industry and strategy. It removed sanctuary from the enemy and turned distance into an advantage rather than a limitation. Its legacy is also inseparable from the men who flew it. Young pilots crossed hostile skies day after day, trusting a machine that carried them farther from safety than any fighter before. Some returned, many did not. Their experiences define the true cost behind the Mustang's success. In the years that followed, aviation would move on. Jets would replace propellers. Speed would increase beyond imagination. But the principles the P-51 embodied, efficiency, balance, endurance, would remain central to air combat design. Today, the Mustang stands as a symbol not just of American engineering, but of a turning point in modern warfare. It reminds us that victory is often decided not by the most powerful weapon, but by the one that arrives when it is needed most, and stays until the job is done.